Columbus, Ohio, November 15, 1906. A boy is born into a family that can barely keep food on the table. His father, Irving LeMay, is an iron worker and handyman who can never hold a job for more than a few months. His mother, Arizona Dove, does everything she can to keep her children fed as the family moves from town to town, state to state, chasing whatever work Irving can find. They go as far as Montana and California before eventually returning to Columbus. That boy's name is Curtis Emerson LeMay, and before his life is over, he will orchestrate the single most destructive night in human history. He will be responsible for more civilian deaths than any other American commander. He will famously say, "If we lose, we'll be tried as war criminals." And then, in one of history's greatest ironies, this same ruthless general will find himself in a position where his very willingness to use overwhelming force may have prevented World War III. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to that poor kid in Columbus. Young Curtis knew what it meant to go hungry. He understood responsibility early because he had to. While other kids were playing, Curtis was working odd jobs, trying to help his mother feed his younger siblings. The family never stayed in one place long enough for Curtis to really settle in. Every few months, it seemed, they'd pack up and move again because his father had lost another job or heard about work somewhere else. But something happened when Curtis was just 5 years old that changed everything. He looked up and saw an airplane flying overhead. Now, you have to remember, this was 1911. Airplanes were brand new. The Wright brothers had only made their first flight 8 years earlier. Most people had never seen one in person. But young Curtis LeMay saw that machine in the sky, and something clicked inside him. He decided right then and there that he was going to fly. It was an impossible dream for a kid from his background. Flying was for rich people, for adventurers, for folks who had opportunities that the LeMay family could never afford. But Curtis didn't care about impossible. He'd been dealing with impossible his whole life. He worked his way through Columbus South High School, and then he did something remarkable. He enrolled at Ohio State University to study civil engineering. He didn't have the money for it, of course. He worked his way through college, taking whatever jobs he could find. He joined the Reserve Officers Training Corps, the ROTC program, because he knew it was his ticket to the military, and maybe, just maybe, to the cockpit of an airplane. In October 1929, at age 22, Curtis LeMay was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Air Corps Reserve. The next January, he received a regular commission in the United States Army Air Corps. The poor kid from Columbus was going to fly after all, and he was going to be very, very good at it. Curtis LeMay wasn't just good at flying. He was exceptional. By 1934, he'd married a woman named Helen Maitland, and they'd start a family together. But LeMay's real love affair was with flying, with precision, with getting the job done no matter what it took. In August 1937, something happened that showed everyone what kind of officer Curtis LeMay was. He was serving as navigator on a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, one of the new heavy bombers the Air Corps was testing. The Navy was running exercises off the California coast and had given the wrong coordinates for their battleship Utah. They wanted to see if the Air Corps could actually be doing by a ship at sea. They were pretty confident the flyboys would fail. LeMay was given coordinates that were 60 miles off from where the ship actually was. Most navigators would have given up. But LeMay kept searching, kept calculating, and with only 10 minutes left in the exercise, he spotted the Utah through a break in the clouds. The B-17 came screaming in at just 400 feet and pummeled that battleship with practice bombs. The sailors were sunbathing on deck, so sure they wouldn't be found. They were diving for cover as bombs rained down on them. That's who Curtis LeMay was. Give him an impossible task with bad information, and he'd figure out a way to get it done. When World War II started, LeMay was already a major, but the war would turn him into a legend. By October 1942, he was commanding the 305th Bombardment Group, flying missions over Nazi Germany. And this is where LeMay's ruthlessness really began to show. You see, when bombers approached their targets, the standard procedure was to take evasive action, to weave and dodge to avoid anti-aircraft fire. Made sense, right? Harder to hit a moving target. But LeMay looked at the bombing results and realized something. All that dodging meant the bombs were missing their targets. So he ordered his bombers to fly straight and level all the way through their bombing runs. No evasive action, just fly straight into the flak and drop your bombs with precision. His crews thought he was crazy. The losses would be catastrophic, they said. But LeMay had done the math. He knew that if they could actually hit their targets, they could destroy them faster and get home quicker. And you know what? He was right. Losses didn't increase. Accuracy went way up. His superiors took notice. By June 1944, LeMay was commanding almost 500 heavy bombers in Europe. At 38 years old, he was one of the youngest major generals in the entire United States Army. But his real test was still ahead of him. In August 1944, he was transferred to the China-Burma-India Theater. And then in January 1945, he was given perhaps the most important and controversial assignment of his career. They made him commander of the 21st Bomber Command, responsible for strategic bombing operations against Japan. His job was simple to describe but nearly impossible to do. Break Japan's will to fight. End the war. Save the hundreds of thousands of American lives that would be lost in an invasion of the Japanese home islands. There was just one problem. Nothing was working. When Curtis LeMay arrived in the Mariana Islands to take over the B-29 Superfortress operations against Japan, he inherited a disaster. For months, the bombers had been flying high-altitude precision bombing raids against Japanese factories, just like they'd done in Europe, and it was failing miserably. Japan had this thing called the jet stream. Nobody really understood it yet. But what it meant was that when the B-29s flew at 30,000 feet over Japan, they were hitting winds of over 200 miles per hour. Flying with the jet stream, they'd be pushed over their targets so fast they couldn't aim. Flying against it, they'd be sitting ducks for Japanese fighters. Even when the bombers could get to their targets, the results were terrible. Japan's war production wasn't like Germany's. The Japanese had deliberately spread out their manufacturing into thousands of small workshops, scattered throughout residential areas. They figured correctly that the Americans wouldn't be able to hit such small targets with high-altitude bombing. LeMay looked at the results. He looked at the casualty projections for invading Japan. Military planners were estimating 1 million American casualties, maybe more. And he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He was going to burn Japan's cities to the ground. The Japanese cities weren't made of steel and concrete like European cities. They were made of wood and paper. Thousands of years of tradition had created cities that were essentially kindling, waiting for a match. LeMay knew that if you hit them with incendiary bombs, with napalm, with white phosphorus, you could create firestorms that would devastate entire neighborhoods. But here's the thing that made this decision so controversial. You couldn't burn the factories without burning the houses around them. You couldn't destroy the workshops without destroying the neighborhoods. This wasn't precision bombing of military targets. This was area bombing. This was deliberately targeting civilian populations. This was something the United States had always said it would never do. LeMay knew exactly what he was proposing. He later said, "I suppose if I had lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal." But in his mind, the math was simple and cold. Burn the cities, end the war, save American lives. He believed that total war meant total commitment, that trying to fight a humane war just prolonged the suffering. And then LeMay did something that shocked even his own staff. He ordered the B-29s to fly at night, at low altitude, between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, and he ordered them to strip out their defensive guns, except for the Tetto turret, to make room for more bombs. His crews thought this was insane. Flying that low at night without guns, they'd be massacred by Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. But LeMay had intelligence reports that suggested the Japanese didn't have effective low-level anti-aircraft capabilities. And at night, the fighters would have a much harder time finding the bombers. It was a massive gamble. If he was wrong, hundreds of his men would die, and he'd be relieved of command in disgrace. But LeMay was sure he was right. He'd done the calculations. He'd studied the intelligence. And he knew that desperate times called for desperate measures. On March 9, 1945, at sunset, Curtis LeMay stood on Guam and watched as more than 300 B-29 superfortresses lifted off from the crushed coral runway, headed for Tokyo. It was going to be the longest night of his life. Just after midnight on March 10, 1945, the first Pathfinder B-29s arrived over Tokyo. Their job was simple but critical. They dropped their incendiary bombs in a giant X pattern over the target area, creating a burning cross that would guide the following waves of bombers to their aim point. Then came the main force, 279 B-29s, each loaded with incendiaries, M47 incendiary clusters, magnesium bombs, white phosphorus bombs, napalm, all designed for one purpose: to start fires that couldn't be put out. The conditions were perfect for what LeMay had planned, which is to say they were perfect for absolute horror. Tokyo hadn't had rain in weeks. The city was bone dry. The wind was blowing at 25 to 30 miles an hour from the north. And the target area was one of the most densely populated places on Earth, packed with wooden buildings and narrow streets. The first bombs hit around 12:15 a.m. Within minutes, hundreds of fires were burning. Within an hour, those hundreds of fires had merged into dozens of massive conflagrations. And then something happened that the firebombing had been designed to create. The fires merged into a firestorm. If you don't know what a firestorm is, let me explain, because it's important to understand the full horror of what happened that night. A firestorm occurs when separate fires become so hot and so large that they create their own weather system. The superheated air rises so fast that it creates winds at ground level of 60, 70, sometimes 100 miles per hour. These winds suck in air from the surrounding areas, which feeds more oxygen to the fire, which makes it hotter, which creates stronger winds. It becomes a self-sustaining hell. The temperatures in that firestorm reached over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt asphalt, hot enough to boil water, hot enough to literally vaporize human beings. People trying to escape found that the streets themselves were on fire. The asphalt had turned to liquid. Your feet would stick in it and burn. Families jumped into canals and rivers to escape the heat, only to find that the water was boiling. Parents held their children underwater to try to save them from the heat, but the water was so hot it scalded them. People who tried to outrun the flames suffocated because the firestorm was consuming all the oxygen. The bombers kept coming for hours, wave after wave. Some of the crews could smell the burning city from 10,000 feet up. One gunner later said, "I didn't wear an oxygen mask at that altitude. All I can say is that the smell was nauseating. I've never smelled anything like it since, and I don't want to." From 100 miles away, other aircraft could see the glow of Tokyo burning. When the sun rose on March 10, 1945, 16 square miles of Tokyo had been completely destroyed. Over 267,000 buildings were gone, and more than 100,000 people were dead. Some estimates put the death toll as high as 120,000. In a single night, more people died than in the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, more than 4 times as many as died in the firebombing of Dresden. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey later determined that more people likely died during those 6 hours than in any other 6-hour period in human history. And Curtis LeMay? He'd lost 14 bombers, less than 5% of his force. His gamble had worked, but he wasn't done, not even close. Over the next 5 months, LeMay directed similar raids on 66 Japanese cities: Kobe, Nagoya, Osaka, Yokohama. Town after town, city after city, burned under the relentless assault of the B-29s. By the war's end, American bombers had destroyed 178 square miles of Japanese urban areas. They'd killed somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 civilians. They'd left over 8 million people homeless. And then, in August 1945, Curtis LeMay's command dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By that point, sustained massively destructive bombing of Japanese cities had become so routine that some historians argue the atomic bombs didn't seem like a moral decision at all to the commanders involved. They were just 2 more cities to destroy, 2 more steps toward ending the war. LeMay was unrepentant. He believed he'd saved lives by shortening the war. He believed that total war required total commitment. He never softened his views, never expressed regret. "Killing Japanese didn't bother me very much at that time," he later said. "It was getting the war over that bothered me." Victory guaranteed that LeMay's fear of being tried as a war criminal never materialized. Instead, he came home a hero. But his war wasn't over, not by a long shot. After World War II ended, Curtis LeMay could have retired. He was 39 years old. He'd achieved more than most generals achieve in a lifetime. He was one of the most decorated officers in the entire United States military, with medals from countries around the world. He could have gone home to his wife, Helen, and their daughter, Patricia, bought a nice house somewhere, and lived out his days in peace, but that wasn't Curtis LeMay. Within months of the war's end, he was back in action. In 1947, he was appointed commander of United States Air Force Europe, and that's when the Soviets made a major mistake. They blockaded Berlin. LeMay was the architect of the Berlin airlift. For 15 months, American and British aircraft flew supplies into West Berlin, making the Soviet blockade meaningless. It was a massive logistical achievement, and it was LeMay's organizational genius that made it work. The communists backed down, and Curtis LeMay had won a victory without firing a shot, but his next assignment would define the rest of his career and shape the entire Cold War. In October 1948, Curtis LeMay was made commander of Strategic Air Command, or SAC. When LeMay took over SAC, it was a disaster. It consisted of a few understaffed B-29 bomber groups left over from World War II. Less than half the available aircraft were actually operational. The crews were undertrained. Security was a joke. LeMay once inspected a hangar full of nuclear-capable bombers and found a single Air Force sentry on duty. The sentry wasn't even armed. LeMay ordered a mock bombing run on Dayton, Ohio to test his crews. The results horrified him. Most of the bombers missed their targets by over a mile. We didn't have not one crew, in the entire command who could do a professional job, he later said. So Curtis LeMay did what Curtis LeMay always did. He fixed it. Through brutal training, iron discipline, and sheer force of will, he transformed Strategic Air Command from a paper tiger into the most powerful military force the world had ever seen. He built an all-jet bomber fleet. He introduced aerial refueling that gave his bombers global reach. He established a command and control system with unprecedented readiness. He created a force that could put nuclear weapons on target anywhere in the Soviet Union within hours of an order. His airmen nicknamed him Iron Ass and Iron Pants, and they meant it as a compliment. LeMay demanded perfection because anything less could mean nuclear war. He was famously cold, ruthless, and demanding. He had a habit of chomping on an unlit cigar and blowing smoke in the faces of officers who disagreed with him. He communicated his boredom and contempt by leaving the bathroom door open during meetings while he relieved himself. But he got results. By the time LeMay left SAC in 1957, it was ready to fight and win World War III. And that readiness, that overwhelming capability, may be exactly what prevented World War III from ever happening. The Soviets knew that if they started a nuclear war, SAC would obliterate them. It was called Mutual Assured Destruction, or MAD, and Curtis LeMay was the architect of America's side of that equation. In 1957, LeMay was promoted to Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force. In 1961, he became Chief of Staff, the highest position in the Air Force. At 44, he'd been the youngest four-star general in American history since Ulysses S. Grant. Now, at 54, he was running the entire Air Force. And then came October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Curtis LeMay found himself in the most important argument of his life. October 16, 1962. President John F. Kennedy was briefed by his CIA director that Soviet nuclear missiles had been discovered in Cuba, just 90 miles from American shores. For 13 days, the world would teeter on the edge of nuclear war, and Curtis LeMay would find himself on the opposite side of history from his commander-in-chief. LeMay's position was simple and clear. Bomb the missile sites. Bomb them now. Invade Cuba. Overthrow Castro. Show the Soviets that America wouldn't back down. He genuinely believed that the Soviets would do nothing if America acted decisively, that they'd let us bomb their missiles and wouldn't retaliate. On October 19th, Kennedy met with his Joint Chiefs of Staff, including LeMay. The meeting was secretly recorded, and what it captured was extraordinary. You can hear the clash between two completely different worldviews. Kennedy, who'd read history, who understood that World War I had started because of miscalculation, who knew that one mistake could end civilization itself, and LeMay, who believed that overwhelming force was the answer to every problem, who thought Kennedy's caution was weakness. "Are you trying to tell me," Kennedy asked LeMay, That they'll let us bomb their missiles and kill a lot of Russians and then do nothing? They'll do nothing, LeMay replied flatly. If they don't do anything in Cuba, Kennedy shot back, then they'll certainly do something in Berlin. But LeMay wouldn't budge. He called Kennedy's plan for a naval blockade weak. He said it was appeasement, like Chamberlain at Munich. He told the President of the United States, to his face, that his refusal to invade Cuba was almost as bad as the appeasement at Munich and the greatest defeat in our history. You can hear the tension in the recordings. At one point, LeMay told Kennedy, "You're in a pretty bad fix, Mr. President." Kennedy's response was classic. "You're in there with me," he said, and you can hear the forced laughter after. Two men, both patriots, both trying to protect America, but seeing the world in completely opposite ways. LeMay believed America had overwhelming nuclear superiority. He thought they could force the Soviets to back down, or if the Soviets were foolish enough to launch missiles, America could totally annihilate them. In LeMay's worldview, nuclear war was winnable if you struck first and struck hard. But Kennedy understood something LeMay didn't, or wouldn't, that even if America won a nuclear war, the cost would be unimaginable. That you can't win when cities are burning and millions are dead on both sides. That the goal wasn't to win World War III, the goal was to prevent it. Kennedy chose the blockade. The world held its breath, Soviet ships approached the quarantine line, and then, on October 28th, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev announced that he would withdraw the missiles from Cuba. The crisis was over. Kennedy had navigated the closest the world had ever come to nuclear war, and he'd done it by ignoring Curtis LeMay's advice. After the crisis ended, LeMay was furious. He told Kennedy the resolution was the greatest defeat in our history. He argued that even after the Soviets agreed to withdraw, America should invade Cuba anyway. The irony is almost too much to bear. The general who'd been willing to burn 100,000 civilians in Tokyo in a single night, the man who'd built the doomsday machine that could end human civilization, the one who'd argued for bombing the missile sites, may have inadvertently helped prevent World War III. How? Because Kennedy knew that if he chose a military option, he'd have to live with the consequences if LeMay was wrong. And Kennedy was smart enough to know that LeMay might be wrong. Curtis LeMay remained Air Force Chief of Staff until 1965. Even after leaving active duty, he continued to advocate for military solutions to America's problems. During the Vietnam War, he argued that America should bomb North Vietnam back to the Stone Age. The phrase became infamous. To many Americans, it confirmed everything they feared about the old guard generals who saw overwhelming force as the answer to everything. And then Curtis LeMay made perhaps the worst decision of his life. In 1968, he agreed to run as vice president on Alabama Governor George Wallace's third-party presidential ticket. Wallace was a segregationist. The American Independent Party was running on a platform that, to many Americans, represented everything wrong with the past. And there was Curtis LeMay, the man who'd saved Berlin, the man who'd built SAC, the man who'd helped win World War II, standing beside George Wallace. The campaign was a disaster for LeMay personally. At his first press conference, he made comments about nuclear weapons that the press jumped on. He talked about how nuclear weapons weren't as bad as people thought, how we might have to use them someday. The Wallace campaign realized LeMay was a liability. They kept him off the stage for most of the campaign. Wallace and LeMay won 13.5% of the popular vote and 46 electoral votes from 5 states. It was the strongest showing by a third party since the Populists in 1896, but it was also a sad end to a controversial career. After the election, Curtis LeMay retired to Newport Beach, California. He stayed out of the public eye. He was a ham radio operator and a sports car enthusiast. He owned an Allure J2 sports car and would occasionally be seen driving it around Orange County. In 1989, he moved to Air Force Village West, a retirement community near March Air Force Base in Riverside. On October 1st, 1990, Curtis Emerson LeMay died of complications from a heart attack at the age of 83. He was buried at the United States Air Force Academy Cemetery in Colorado Springs, Colorado. His wife, Helen, who'd stood by him through everything, died in 1992 and was buried beside him. So how do we judge Curtis LeMay? That's the question historians have been wrestling with for decades. Was he a war criminal who got away with it because his side won? Was he a brilliant military strategist who did what was necessary to save American lives? Was he a Cold War hero who helped prevent World War III by building a deterrent so powerful nobody dared challenge it? The truth is probably all of those things at once. Curtis LeMay was a man who believed that war was hell, and that if you were going to fight a war, you fought it with everything you had. That half measures just prolonged the suffering. That being ruthless in the short term could save lives in the long term. He once said, "Every soldier thinks something of the moral aspects of what he is doing. But all war is immoral, and if you let that bother you, you're not a good soldier." That quote tells you everything you need to know about how Curtis LeMay saw the world. The firebombing campaign he orchestrated killed between 300,000 and 400,000 Japanese civilians. But the invasion of Japan that those firebombings helped prevent might have killed millions more, both American and Japanese. That's the terrible arithmetic of war that commanders have to grapple with. The strategic air command he built was designed to end human civilization if the order ever came. But the very existence of that overwhelming force may have prevented anyone from ever giving that order. That's the paradox of deterrence. The advice he gave Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis, if followed, might have started World War III. But Kennedy's knowledge that men like LeMay were pushing for military action may have made the Soviets take American resolve more seriously. Curtis LeMay was a man forged in the hardscrabble poverty of early 20th century Ohio, shaped by the ruthless demands of global war and hardened by the terrifying responsibilities of the nuclear age. He was brilliant and cold, innovative and uncompromising, effective and controversial. He never apologized for the firebombings. He never expressed regret for the civilians who died. He never softened his views on the necessity of overwhelming force. Right up until his death, he believed he'd done what needed to be done. History hasn't been kind to Curtis LeMay. To many modern Americans, he represents a kind of militarism that we've moved beyond, a willingness to sacrifice moral considerations on the altar of military effectiveness. The things he did in World War II, if proposed today, would be considered war crimes. The force he built during the Cold War could have ended human civilization. But here's the thing we have to remember, and this is especially important for those of us who lived through those times. Curtis LeMay lived in a different world, a world where America's enemies were real and immediate threats, where the Soviet Union really did want to spread communism across the globe, where the choice wasn't between perfect solutions and imperfect ones, but between terrible options and potentially catastrophic ones. He was the right man for that time because he was willing to make decisions that would haunt anyone with a conscience. He was willing to do the terrible math of war and live with the results. And maybe, just maybe, his willingness to be ruthless is part of why we're still here to debate his legacy. The poor kid from Columbus, who looked up and saw an airplane, grew up to become one of the most powerful and controversial military leaders in American history. He helped win the greatest war the world had ever seen. He built the most powerful military force in human history, and he clashed with presidents over the fate of the world. Love him or hate him, you can't ignore Curtis LeMay. His shadow stretches across the entire history of the 20th century warfare, and the debates about what he did and whether it was necessary continue to this day. That's the legacy of Iron Ass, the general who was willing to do anything to win, and whether that makes him a hero or a villain might just depend on whether you think the ends justified the means.